the shadows of revolution, beyond the blood-stained fields of Trenton and Monmouth, a different kind of war was being fought. It wasn't recorded in textbooks, it wasn't carved into monuments, but it was no less dangerous, no less heroic. And it happened right here, on the waters of Raritan Bay, before the stars and stripes flew freely, before the Declaration echoed across the colonies. The tides were already turning. Here, in the vast stretch of bay between Staten Island and New Jersey, where rivers and saltwater converge, a hidden front line emerged. This was no ordinary battlefield. This was a liquid frontier, unpredictable, shifting, treacherous. British warships anchored in the harbor. Continental spies rode through fog and moonlight. Fishermen became freedom fighters. And cannon fire cracked the morning calm as towns awoke to war. They fought not for glory, but for survival, for country, for freedom. Fighting for freedom on Raritan Bay.
This is John Schneider. I'd like to read to you from my book called Fighting for Freedom on Raritan Bay. It's really to honor America's 250th anniversary, and this is the introduction. Fighting for Freedom on Raritan Bay tells the extraordinary and often overlooked story of how America's fight for independence played out in the hidden harbors, tidal straits, and fog-drenched waters of New Jersey and New York. As the mighty British Navy dropped anchor in New York Harbor, expecting to crush a fledgling rebellion, they underestimated a different kind of force, one driven not by cannons, but by cunning, courage, and a very intimate knowledge of the coastline. From the Staten Island raids to the nighttime ferry crossings of spies, from privateer ambushes on Sandy Hook to the icy resolve at Trenton and Princeton, this richly detailed account brings the Revolutionary War to life through a new lens, the waterways that shaped it. With chapters grounded in primary sources, vivid character studies, and personal reflections, I drew on years of exploration, research, and in part from my close friendship with the late revolutionary detective Robert A. Mears. This book is about battles, secret activities in the marshes, smoke on the horizon, and the relentless pull of freedom. It's about the people who risked everything, often in boats barely bigger than bathtubs, to carve out the possibility of establishing a new nation. Now, I'm publishing this book just in time to celebrate America's 250th anniversary, and Fighting for Freedom on Raritan Bay is a tribute and a call to remember, revisit, and reimagine what liberty meant and what it still means today. And hopefully the following pages that I'm going to read to you will provide a unique perspective on America's fight for independence that few people have ever encountered. And I want to dedicate this book to my close and dearly departed friend, Robert A. Mears. He was known to many as the revolutionary detective, and Robert was more than a scholar. He was a living embodiment of the past, a man whose heart seemed to beat in rhythm with the drum rolls of the 18th century, and whose curiosity and dedication to uncovering hidden truths from the Revolutionary War were unmatched. Robert passed away this year, 2025, and he left a legacy of discovery, mentorship, and friendship. We shared a lot of journeys together. We stood where soldiers once stood. We debated where troops had moved. We imagined where cannonballs had landed. And we shared the quiet awe in places where history lay beneath our feet. And these pilgrimages that Bob and I took together were more than researching. They were sacred rituals, I think, of remembrance. Robert authored a brilliant collection of books, each a testament to his rigorous investigation and relentless pursuit of forgotten stories. His works range from detailed studies of espionage and battlefield tactics to personal portraits of ordinary citizens who made the extraordinary possible. He brought to light the corners of the revolution, long shadowed by time. His writing didn't just inform, it inspired. This book too bears his influence. His voice, always measured and wise, guided many of the following chapters that I wrote. His sharp insight helped me understand the power of place, especially on the waters and shores of Raritan Bay. Above all, his friendship made the journey joyful. Bob, your spirit is in these pages. Your love for the Revolution has shaped my love of the Revolution. And your legacy, like the tide, continues to move me forward, inspiring me with your passion for history. And so, Bob, this book is for you. I think to understand who we are as a nation, we have to remember who we were when we chose to be free. Revolution wasn't just fought with muskets, it was forged in courage and the will of everyday people who refused to be ruled. So this is the prologue, a storm on the horizon. So from the first arrival of European settlers along the eastern seaboard, the waterways of North America were more than mere geographical features. They were lifelines, highways, and eventually battlegrounds. In the estuaries, bays, and rivers that threaded throughout the land, the earliest shape of America began to form. The war on the water didn't start with cannon fire, but with commerce, political control, and the slow erosion of patience in the hearts of colonists who would one day be patriots. The early 1600s saw the Dutch, English, and French jostling for dominance over this new land. The Dutch established New Amsterdam along the southern tip of Manhattan, leveraging the Hudson River as a route for trade and military movement. Meanwhile, English settlers established colonies, mostly in New England and the Chesapeake Bay areas. The great rivers, the Hudson, Delaware, and the Raritan, served as critical arteries for moving goods, people, and information. See, whoever controlled the waterways held immense power. So long before an open rebellion by a young America, water served as a mirror of the shifting tides of power. Merchant ships loaded with furs, lumber, rum, and molasses carved watery paths between ports, colonies, and the far reaches of the British Empire. The Atlantic was both a connector and a barrier, linking the colonies to London while also creating distance which enabled independence to grow in the hearts of settlers. And colonists began to see themselves as separate, but not just geographically, but ideologically. And so the war on the water, an invisible war of tariffs and taxes and territorial tensions, began to ripple beneath the surface of the water. The British Empire had overextended itself, and it was debt-ridden after the 7 Years' War, known in the colonies as the French and Indian War, and it saw its colonies not just as partners, but as profit centers. The 1760s brought a series of increasingly burdensome regulations designed to squeeze revenue from the colonies. First, it was the Sugar Act of 1764. Then it was the Stamp Act of 1765. And later it was the Townshend Act in 1767. I mean, each of these laws had implications not just on land, but also at sea. British ships began to patrol American ports more aggressively, enforcing trade restrictions and seizing goods they claimed violated the Crown's law. Nowhere was this more keenly felt than in the bustling waters between New York and New Jersey. These were not just places of trade, they were communities unto themselves. Small wharves, fishing towns, and merchant families depended on freedom of navigation. And yet, as the Crown's grip tightened, more colonists faced blockades, inspections, and confiscations. The harbors were no longer open gateways, they were checkpoints. Water once shared became contested. Nowhere was this strategic pressure more visible than in the waters of the New York-New Jersey Bight. The great inward curve of coastline stretching from Sandy Hook to Montauk. This bight, spelled B-I-G-H-T, embraces New York Harbor, Raritan Bay, and Long Island Sound entrances and became a fluid front line. So whoever controlled it had access to the arteries of rebellion or repression. The British Navy anchored itself in the harbor's deep waters, transforming New York into a fortified command center. We're going to talk about that. At the same time, rebel smugglers and privateers emerged from New Jersey's shallow inlets like ghosts striking at supply ships and then vanishing into the fog. Resistance often came not from formal armies, but from ordinary people who knew the tides. They knew the coves and ships better than any officer in a red uniform. So smuggling became a form of protest. Clever mariners navigated through inlets and creeks by moonlight, avoiding customs agents and delivering goods directly to those who needed them. Entire communities, like those along the Raritan Bay and Sandy Hook, learned to live with one foot on the shore and one eye on the horizon, watching for the telltale sails of the Royal Navy. Sandy Hook and Highland stood watch over the Bight, providing vital observation points where local patriots tracked ship movements and warned of enemy approaches. The geography of the Bight, its shoals and its sandbars and variable depths and all that, favored small, swift vessels and frustrated larger British ships. The Bight was not just water. It was a strategic and vital location for the possible defense against enemies. From Keyport to Long Island, fishermen became fighters, and merchant sloops became warcraft. The region gave rise to a kind of coastal chess game. Raids, counter-raids, and intelligence smuggled by boat under moonlight. As tensions rose, so too did a sense of shared injustice. A common language of resistance began to form in the taverns and meeting halls of waterfront towns. In these ports, like Keyport and Perth Amboy and New Brunswick, just to name a few, news from Boston or Philadelphia arrived not by horseback, but by ship. Boats brought more than cargo, they also brought new ideas. Thomas Paine's pamphlets, Patrick Henry's speeches, and the tales of protests like the Boston Tea Party traveled the water routes as quickly as any official dispatch. So while the Boston Tea Party of 1773 is often remembered as a land-based event at the docks, its implications were entirely maritime. The destruction of tea aboard British ships directly challenged naval authority, and the response was swift. It was the coercive axe. That's what they called it. They also called it the intolerable axe. That's what they called them in the colonies. It was aimed to isolate and punish Boston, but they also ignited a spark up and down the Atlantic coast. Even the quieter harbors of New Jersey felt the shift in mood. So by 1774, as the First Continental Congress convened, the war on the water was already well underway. British ships began restricting colonial movement, cutting off supplies and enforcing embargoes. Militias formed not only on land, but on boats. The idea of a continental navy was born out of necessity, a realization that if the waters could be controlled, so too could the people. Battlefield images of Lexington and Concord or Valley Forge often overshadow the broader American history of the Revolutionary War. But again, long before muskets were fired, there was a different kind of warfare. Battles to control harbors, struggles over shipping rights, and midnight raids at sea. These early conflicts laid the groundwork for the full-scale revolution that would follow. And one such incident that I want to mention to you, it's often overlooked. It occurred in 1772 off the coast of Rhode Island. It was something the American colonists did. They burned the British customs schooner the Gaspee, and this was one of the first direct attacks on a British naval vessel, and it sparked outrage in London. It was a sign that American resistance was no longer confined to letters and protests. It was becoming physical, bold, and irrevocable. As a result, British naval power continued to pose a constant threat in the New York and New Jersey region. And so as the colonists prepared for war, so too did local shipbuilders, many of whom began crafting vessels designed not for trade, but for speed, agility, and conflict. These ships would become the earliest tools of the Continental Navy, joined by converted merchant ships armed with cannons and manned with patriotic courage. The war on the water was not just a military confrontation, but also a philosophical one. It was about ownership, liberty, and the right to self-determination. When the American patriots looked out at the vast expanse of the ocean, they didn't see a highway to England. They saw a boundary they could cross, a realm they could claim, and a future they could build. The Atlantic no longer looked like the edge of a British map. It looked like the opening of a new one. So by the time the shots rang out in 1775, the American people had already begun waging their revolution for years, silently, steadily, and often soaked in water, salt water. But before the crash of cannon fire echoed across New York Harbor, redcoats began marching through fields, and rebel troops rode through the fog. This was very definitely a quiet storm brewing here, a storm of ideas, grievances, and broken trust between a colony and its mother country. However, in the mid-1700s, the American colonies were not, I repeat, were not a unified people dreaming of their independence. They were Englishmen and women, at least in identity, living across the Atlantic under the rule of a distant monarch. For generations, the colonies had grown accustomed to British protection and trade. Many colonists proudly considered themselves loyal subjects of the crown, and ties to England ran deep in things like language, religion, law, and tradition. Nevertheless, tension was brewing under the surface of America's relationship with England. The colonies had built economies, cultures, and towns with limited interference, enjoying a period known as salutary neglect. That changed after the costly French and Indian War, when Britain sought to tighten its grip, imposing taxes and regulations to refill imperial coffers. So they came up with the Sugar Act. They came up with the Stamp Act, the Quartering Act, the Tea Act, and with each new imposition, frustration began boiling over. These weren't just taxes. They were symbols of being ruled without a voice. No taxation without representation was more than a slogan. It was a cry for autonomy, a demand to be heard and seen. Still, most colonists hoped for reconciliation. Even after the Boston Massacre and the Tea Party, many viewed independence as a last resort. Letters were written and petitions were sent. The olive branch had been extended, but the British response was silence, or worse, punishment. And incidentally, during the time of the American Revolution, it typically took about 6 to 12 weeks for a letter to be delivered from America to England by ship, and that depended on the season, the weather, the sea conditions, and the ship's route. And then, of course, it took even longer for a response to return. So, suddenly, I'm going to say suddenly here because it was April 1775, the first shot rang out. It happened in Lexington, Massachusetts. British troops marched to seize some rebel arms. American militiamen stood in their path. No one knows who fired first, but the shot, quote, heard round the world, shattered the illusion of peace. By the time the sun rose over Concord, the colonies, like it or not, were at war. And from that moment, the timeline quickened. A battle at Breed's Hill bloodied both sides. In July 1776, the colonies declared independence, a bold act of treason in British eyes. What followed was not just a rebellion, but a redefinition of what it meant to be free. Still, the war hadn't touched New York or the waters of Raritan Bay for nearly a year. That would change, however. New York was too important to ignore. Its harbor was deep, and its geography was strategic. It was a wedge between New England and the rest of the colonies. If Britain could take it, they could split the rebellion in two, and so they eventually entered Raritan Bay to do just that. In July 1776, just days after the Declaration of Independence was signed in Philadelphia, the British fleet appeared like a dark cloud on the sea. They sailed from the Atlantic into the New York-New Jersey Bight, hundreds of ships, thousands of soldiers, and the full weight of an empire. By August, the war had arrived on the waves, rolling in toward New York City, and it would not leave quickly. What began in Massachusetts would now crash onto the shores of Staten Island, Brooklyn, and the surrounding communities along Raritan Bay. This wasn't just a battle for territory. It was a battle for identity, a war waged not only on land, but also across rivers, bays, and tidal straits. This book that I'm going to read to you tells you the story of what happened in the quiet coves and inlets of this area. And in my book, you're going to see how America's waterways, once overlooked in their importance during the Revolutionary War, actually became the lifeblood of resistance. These bays, rivers, and inlets were not just borders or backdrops, but the very arteries of rebellion. Along these waters, power was ferried in whispers, coded messages tucked into coat pockets, and lantern signals came from across the water. We're going to meet the leaders and the unknowns. We're going to see the generals and the fishermen, the spies and the scouts, the enslaved and the free, each playing a role in a war that was fought not only with bullets, but with boats, knowledge of tides, and sheer audacity. Because freedom didn't just ring, it rode under moonlight. It sailed against the wind. It drifted like a ghost through the fog and clashed in silence before dawn. It was hidden in coves and carved into the salt-worn hulls of privateers. It slipped past the enemy in sloops no larger than a horse cart, carrying hope and defiance in equal measure. And so, this is the story of what happened when the fight for independence took to the water, when the tide became a weapon and the shoreline became a front line. This is the fight for freedom in Raritan Bay. Chapter 1, The Fleet in the Fog. August 1776. Dawn cracked over the Atlantic like a musket shot. The people of New York and New Jersey, still half asleep in their wooden homes and sleepy harbor towns, awoke to a sight few would ever forget. The horizon was gone, replaced by masts. British warships, hundreds strong, filled the lower bay, anchored off Staten Island like a steel curtain. It was, in fact, the largest amphibious invasion the world had ever seen at that time. More than 400 ships arrived, carrying more than 30,000 soldiers, sailors, and supplies for a campaign expected to achieve swift dominance. Children counted the sails from porches. Farmers paused their work and stared at the sea in awe. Ministers whispered of Armageddon. The British had arrived in full force, and the world's most powerful empire had just set its eye on Manhattan. The Royal Navy controlled the sea lanes from its anchorage in the New York-New Jersey Bight. British commanders, including General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe, established a base on Staten Island, transforming the previously peaceful enclave into a staging ground for one of the most coordinated assaults in colonial history. Now, once a pastoral haven of farms and woodlands, Staten Island was now overrun with tents and horses and polished boots, redcoats drilled in precise columns while naval cannons loomed offshore, casting long shadows over the coast. Civilians fled, their fields trampled, and their homes requisitioned. For the Loyalists, it was a promise of order. For the Patriots, it was a prelude to invasion. British General William Howe moved methodically. He believed in calculated dominance. He was tall, reserved, and battle-tested. He had actually served in North America during the French and Indian War. Now he stood atop Staten Island's ridges with a telescope, convinced the rebellion would be quelled with one overwhelming strike. His brother, Admiral Richard Howe, remained aboard his flagship, coordinating the vast armada like a conductor over an orchestra of war. Unlike his brother, he preferred diplomacy, having once quietly lobbied in Parliament for reconciliation with the colonies. But now, his cannons faced Manhattan. Across the bay, General George Washington stood. His underfed, undertrained Continental Army, barely more than 20,000 strong. Most were farmers with muskets, teenagers in oversized uniforms, and veterans of skirmishes, but not wars. Washington was tall and stern. His uniform was weathered, his eyes set with resolve. He had no illusions about the strength of the British, but what he lacked in resources he made up for in clarity. His command style was quiet but firm. To his men he was both a leader and father. To his enemies, he was a phantom, always just beyond reach. The Continental Army didn't have matching coats, but they had resolve. They didn't have a fleet, but they had some ferries, rowboats, and schooners captained by fishermen who knew the moon's habits and the river's moods. These weren't professional soldiers. They were locals who knew how to fight, not by marching in lines, but by vanishing into the reeds and launching surprise attacks from the windows and the shadows. Among them were boys like Silas, a 15-year-old from Perth Amboy, who had never fired a musket in anger. He carried his father's powder horn, a too-large hat, and an unwavering look of determination. And men like Ezra, a 50-year-old sailor turned scout who had once traded rum with British officers before the taxes made him rebel. Ezra's knowledge of the Raritan tides was more valuable than any musket. They fought for freedom, yes, but also for familiarity, for the land they knew, for the harbors that raised them, for the right to choose their leaders, even if they slept in the mud beside them. While the British encamped in grandeur, the Americans dug trenches in the mud. While British drums echoed across the harbor, Patriot campfires flickered in silence. Spies moved in both directions. Across Raritan Bay, signal lanterns blinked from the shadows, and rowboats slipped through the moonlight bearing messages, supplies, or warnings. The British had landed on Long Island on August 22nd. Days later, the Battle of Brooklyn, also known as the Battle of Long Island, erupted. It was a brutal, chaotic engagement that proved the British were as ruthless as they were organized. The Americans were flanked, routed, and nearly destroyed. British General Henry Clinton exploited a little-known path behind American lines thanks to loyalist informants familiar with the terrain, and drove a wedge through the inexperienced Patriot positions. The redcoats closed in with bayonets, and chaos reigned. Bodies fell by the hundreds. The smoke thickened, muskets cracked, and drums pounded. The Patriots, despite their bravery, were pushed back. For many, it was their first taste of large-scale warfare, and it wasn't enjoyable. Watching from the rear, Washington's face remained set in stone, but inside he felt the weight of failure. Still, he didn't flee. He watched, he learned, he waited. Had the British pressed their advantage, the revolution might have ended then and there. He hesitated, uncertain how much of Washington's force remained unbroken, and that hesitation gave Washington his chance. So by the light of the moon, and with the aid of thick fog, Washington coordinated one of the most incredible escapes in military history. On the nights of August 29th through the 30th, he used rowboats and ferries, and he evacuated more than 9,000 men across the East River from Brooklyn to Manhattan without losing a single soldier. It was a logistical miracle. Fishermen and mariners from the East River and Raritan Bay took the helm. The boats moved silently, hour after hour through the darkness. Washington supervised the effort, standing on the shoreline until the last ship was launched. The fog rolled in just before dawn and clung to the river like a curtain drawn by Providence itself. British scouts never saw the movement, even though it was just a few hundred yards away. When the fog lifted, the Americans vanished into the New York shoreline. Local lore holds that even the tides favored the Patriots that morning. The winds held steady, the currents cooperated, and the waters that should have trapped them became their salvation. It was the Americans' first significant use of New York's waterways as a defensive weapon, and it wouldn't be the last. And this part of the war made one thing clear: geography would be a weapon. Waterways were no longer just obstacles or borders. They were living parts of the battlefield. The tides could betray an army or protect it. The fog could hide failure or deliver victory. The revolution had officially been taken to the waves. Despite their overwhelming superiority, the British would never fully control the region from this moment forward. Ha! The Americans had proven they could slip through the fingers of steel and that the bay and the rivers could be allies if you knew how to read them. This moment also reshaped Washington's approach to war. It wasn't about confronting the enemy in force. It was about mobility, timing, using the landscape, especially the waterways, to disrupt the British strategy. You know, Washington once said, in 1781, he said, "It follows then, as certain as that night succeeds the day, that without a decisive naval force, we can do nothing definitive. With it, everything honorable and glorious." The men who helped Washington make the escape possible, pilots from Perth Amboy, ferrymen from New Brunswick, and boatmen from Queens, would go on to form the backbone of future river operations. They knew which codes could hide a schooner. They knew how long it took to row across Raritan Bay with a full moon. They became navigators of the Revolution. From the shores of Staten Island to the marshy inlets of Keyport, the waters bore witness to the whispers of rebellion and the clatter of cannon fire. The war would continue for years, but its tone had shifted. Now every ferry crossing was a potential ambush. Every fishing boat could carry muskets. Every estuary held secrets. And as the war shifted inland and outward, one truth remained. The revolution would not be won by sea power, but could be lost without it. Even as British warships loomed like floating giants off the coast and redcoats established strategic positions on Staten Island, the Revolution refused to unfold like a conventional war. No lines of men exchanging fire in neat succession. There are no clarion calls announcing battles. Instead, the shadows moved first across the water through the reeds and under the cover of moonlight. Staten Island, seized by British forces in the summer of 1776, quickly became a fortress and target for attack. The island was too close to New Jersey for the Patriots' comfort, and so it became the stage for a new kind of warfare, a war of raids and whispers, not drums. In New Brunswick, a young officer named Captain Joshua Huddy studied the tides as if they were scripture. He knew the way the moon tugged at the Raritan. He could glide a flat-bottomed boat into the Arthur Kill without a splash. To him and others like him, the war wasn't fought in formations, but in silence. The raids began as pinpricks. A Loyalist outpost here, a supply shipment there. Late at night, Patriot oarsmen would launch from the marshes of New Jersey and row across to Staten Island, slipping between sentries like they were invisible. Sometimes they returned with prisoners, sometimes they didn't return at all. Ezra Tompkins, a seasoned sailor from Perth Amboy, had once hauled nets of cod and baskets of crabs from the Navesink. Now he ferried secrets. He guided rebel crews through moonlight channels and left coded flags on riverbanks. The bay had changed from a place of livelihood to a frontier of resistance. General William Alexander, a.k.a. Lord Stirling, approved and encouraged these missions. He was a patriot. Although a man of aristocratic birth, he possessed the grit and local knowledge to appreciate the value of small victories. So under his command, militia raids became a routine occurrence. They struck purposefully, not to conquer, but to harass, disrupt, and remind the British they were never safe. One cold night, January 1777, Stirling launched one of the most brazen raids yet. With 500 men, he crossed the icy waters of the Arthur Kill and landed on Staten Island under darkness. The mission? To disrupt a garrison of Loyalists and destroy supplies. The skirmish that followed was brief but fierce. Smoke, flame lit the winter sky, and they returned, captured arms, intelligence, and prisoners. Among Stirling's men was a young African-American scout named Elijah Wade, formerly enslaved and now fighting for the cause of freedom, his own and his country's. Elijah's knowledge of the forests along the Raritan and his quick thinking during retreats saved lives on more than one occasion. He would lead reconnaissance teams and became a symbol of bravery among the troops. Meanwhile, women like Sarah Oliver and Ruth Stokes operated an invisible network of messengers, signals, and safe houses. Sarah's porch in Woodbridge doubled as a relay station. Laundry hung in specific patterns served as coded instructions. 1 red kerchief, safe to cross. 2, danger nearby. They never carried rifles, but their work was every bit as essential and dangerous. Not all the locals supported the rebels. Let's be clear, Staten Island had a substantial Loyalist population. John Bartow, a wealthy merchant and fervent supporter of the Crown, supplied British troops with horses and fresh food. Bartow's estate became a target of one of Joshua Huddy's raids. Although the attack was swift and caused minimal damage, it struck fear into the Loyalist community. By 1778, Staten Island resembled a fortress under siege. British forts ringed the shoreline. Patrols doubled and curfews tightened. Yet still the boats came, darting through the fog, hugging marshes, and vanishing into coves. British naval officers grew increasingly frustrated by their inability to stem the tide of the enemy's advances. Rear Admiral Richard Howe, brother to General William Howe, who we already mentioned, ordered more gunboats into the bay, but they were too large, too slow, and foreign to the waters. One of the most daring missions involved capturing a British paymaster's transport to distribute gold to Loyalist troops. Ezra Tompkins and Elijah Wade led the attack, disguised as fishermen. They boarded the vessel, overpowered the few guards, and absconded with the payroll. It was a windfall for the Patriots and a public embarrassment for the British. The British countered with brutal retaliations. They burned homes suspected of sheltering spies. They imprisoned suspected sympathizers. Huddy himself would eventually be captured and hanged without trial in 1782, a grim reminder that this was not a gentleman's war. It was personal and it was brutal. Journal enemies from the Patriots reveal the emotional toil. Here's one from Private Silas Brower with the Monmouth Militia. It was January 23rd. He said, "We crossed the Kill again tonight. The third time in 4 weeks. The wind was low and the tide was in our favor. We made it to the bluff undetected. Took 3 prisoners. One cried. He looked no older than my brother. War makes ghosts of boys before their time." Another was Captain Ezra Tompkins, who on February 3rd said, "Ruth signaled us with 2 shirts and a bonnet." The message received was that the British patrol was to the north. We rerouted. God bless her. This war against England was brutal and dangerous for everybody who lived in America, no matter who they supported. Many of these raids, though small in scale, defined the rhythm of the revolution along the bay. They were acts of resistance that kept the enemy guessing and the cause alive. They demonstrated that, although the British may have held Staten Island, they could never truly control the surrounding waters. Every tide was a threat. Every fog bank was a veil. Every oar stroke was a step toward freedom. For the British, the bay was an uneasy moat. For the Patriots, it was a lifeline of movement and momentum. What the Revolution lacked in organized naval power around Raritan Bay, it made up for in ingenuity. A few men in a skiff could disrupt supply chains, scatter Loyalist patrols, or remind the Crown that its empire had cracks. The geography of the bay, with its winding inlets, marshes, and hidden coves, favored those who knew it intimately. Local militias and seafaring men turned these features into advantages, weaving in and out of danger with an intimacy the British Navy could never match. The winter of 1776 had been the darkest time for the Continental Army. After their victory in New York, the British pursued Washington's forces across New Jersey, capturing key towns and sending American morale to its lowest point since the start of the war. Washington's men were tired, cold, and hungry. They had been defeated in several engagements and were forced to retreat repeatedly. In November, the British crossed into New Jersey, and by mid-December, they had captured the capital, Trenton, and were on the verge of securing a larger portion of the region. And to make matters worse, many of Washington's soldiers had been enlisted for only 1 year. Their contracts were about to expire. The Army's ranks were thinning, and desertions were a constant worry, and to some, it seemed as though the American Revolution would be a hopeless cause, doomed to fail under the relentless pressure of the British war machine. Yet, Washington refused to give in to this despair. He saw what others couldn't see, an opportunity hidden in the cold shadows of defeat. It was the kind of opportunity that required skill, determination, and bravery, which were qualities Washington was never short on. British forces had also taken Manhattan. The Continental Army had been driven across New Jersey, chased from town to town like foxes in a field. Washington's troops were pretty hungry. They were ill-clothed and demoralized, and as already mentioned, desertions were on the rise. Enlistments were expiring, and winter pressed in like a slow, cold vice. It seemed as though the flame of independence might flicker out before the new year, but sometimes it is when the fire is lowest that sparks leap the highest. General George Washington, ever somber, ever calculating, stood on the banks of the Delaware River on Christmas night. The icy waters churned before him. His army, what remained of it, stood ready with boats, oars, and blankets, shivering in the dark. Their mission was to cross the river under the cover of night, march through a blizzard, and strike the Hessian garrison at Trenton by dawn. Oh, easy for you. It was madness, but it was also ingenious. The mission was daring, but Washington had one advantage: the weather. The British and their allies were not expecting an attack in the dead of winter, especially on Christmas night when they were celebrating the holiday. By the time they reached the town of Trenton, the Hessians were still asleep, hungover from their Christmas revelry. Washington's forces struck swiftly. The attack was brutal and efficient. The Continental Army overpowered the outnumbered Hessians in less than an hour. Nearly 1,000 Hessians were taken prisoner, while the Americans suffered minimal casualties. The victory was not just a tactical win, but a psychological one. It proved to the people of America and the world that the Revolution was not, in fact, dead. It demonstrated that Washington, one uncertain about his role as a military leader, could adapt and execute a bold plan with precision. Yet, Washington didn't rest on his laurels. Rather than retreat after the victory, which he could have done, he continued the pursuit of the British forces, crossing the Delaware again to press the advantage. January 3rd, 1777, he met British troops at Princeton, using feints, in other words, pretending to attack one side while the main force attacked the weaker spot in the cover of woods. Washington routed the British once more. Still energized by their victory, Washington's troops had outflanked British General Cornwallis's forces and attacked the British rear guard. It was a week that changed the course of the war. The Battle of Princeton was a turning point. Not only did it bolster American morale, but it also forced the British to rethink their strategy. Cornwallis had intended to push the Americans further into the interior of New Jersey, but the Continental Army's swift and surprising attacks disrupted British plans. The Revolution, which had seemed on the brink of collapse, was now showing even more signs of resurgence. And what made these battles extraordinary wasn't just the victories, it was the planning, the water crossings, and the timing that made the difference. It was becoming increasingly clear that rivers were no longer obstacles. The waterways were, in fact, Washington's allies. He used them like chess pieces, placing his forces in unpredictable ways, striking when the British were weakened, such as by overeating and being groggy from drinking. These moments demonstrated to the world that the rebellion was still a force to be reckoned with, and that George Washington, the reluctant general, had found his stride. So back along the Raritan, the news of the victories raced like lightning. Patriots had begun to doubt, felt hope stir again. The militia units regrouped, spies returned to their networks, even loyalist strongholds like Staten Island tightened their defenses. The Revolution had stepped back from the edge of a cliff, and now it would begin to push forward. But these victories were not just about soldiers charging into battles. They were about the transformation of a commander, the strategic use of terrain like the waterways, and the unyielding will to overcome impossible odds. Washington's ability to use water crossings as strategic tools was unprecedented. Where the British saw rivers as natural barriers to their movement, Washington saw them as roads to maneuver. In Trenton and Princeton, the rivers weren't just obstacles, but gateways to victory. Washington's army was small, and his resources were limited, but by crossing rivers under the cover of night, Washington created confusion among the British and outflanked them in ways that traditional, more conventional battles would not have allowed. The Continental Army's use of rivers, such as the Delaware and the Raritan, became a defining feature of the early part of the war, and it was a strategy that relied not on overwhelming force, but on unpredictability and precision. And the victories at Trenton and Princeton really did mark a crucial moment in Washington's transformation as commander. We talked about this. Before this, some criticized him for his cautiousness and inability to win decisive battles. However, these victories proved that Washington was a leader capable of thinking strategically and seizing opportunities when they arose. His brilliance lay not in his ability to lead from behind a desk, but in his capacity to adapt to the ever-changing landscape of war. He understood that victory did not always come from battlefield triumphs, but from gaining the trust and morale of his soldiers, as well as from keeping his enemy off balance. The American Revolution was no longer an insurgency. It was a war of persistence with rivers, forests, and the very terrain that had become weapons in Washington's hands. Although small in scale compared to the epic battles that would follow, these victories had far-reaching consequences. They proved that the American army, could fight and win against the might of the British Empire. What? More importantly, they revitalized the spirits of the American people. So where despair had once reigned, hope began to grow anew. In the aftermath of the Battle of Princeton, news of Washington's victories spread quickly throughout the colonies, as you might expect. Continental Army's morale soared, and guess what? Recruits began to join the cause. Using the rivers and terrain to his advantage, Washington's unconventional warfare strategy became a model for future American tactics. And the victories at Trenton and Princeton also had international implications. France, which had been watching the conflict with interest, saw these victories as a sign that the Americans might have a chance against the British. And this increased France's support for the American cause, both financially and militarily. In many ways, these early victories helped lay the foundation for the critical alliance with France that would be instrumental in the Revolution's ultimate success. The British were now on the defensive, and their attention shifted to controlling the southern colonies, where they hoped to rally Loyalist support. So as the winter of 1777 approached, Washington and his army had secured their place on the revolutionary map. They had gained new momentum and began to prove that the cause of liberty would not be easily extinguished. The British may have been the most powerful military force in the world, but the spirit of the American people, hooray, embodied by Washington, would not be so easily crushed. The war was far from over. The American Revolution would continue to unfold across the colony's rivers, fields, and towns, where the fight for freedom would reach its conclusion, one that would change the world forever. By the close of 1776, the British had transformed New York Harbor into something more than a port. It was a fortress. The story of that transformation, the strategies, and the power it projected, and the local resistance that inspired is one of tides, tactics, and terrifying control. From the East River to Kill Van Kull, the harbors, bays, and inlets surrounding Manhattan and Staten Island bristled with British warships. Masts crowded the skyline like a ghostly forest. The Royal Navy's red insignia flapped from ships bristling with cannons. Soldiers moved through fortified streets and garrisoned homes. Fortifications lined the waterfront. Once a vital hub of colonial commerce, the city had become the beating heart of British power in North America. Dominate the sea and you starve them of supplies. New York wasn't just symbolic, it was strategic. With Staten Island firmly in British hands, redcoats spread through Brooklyn and Manhattan and eventually seized Fort Washington. Rebel defenses collapsed under the weight of superior firepower and naval support, and Washington was forced to retreat across New Jersey. The revolution teetered, as we said before. However, the British underestimated both the geography and the people. As the British planted flags in cities and patrolled harbors, they assumed dominance. Dominance on a map does not always equal control in practice. Patriots didn't need to defeat the Royal Navy. They only needed to avoid it, outwit it, and survive it. So British blockades soon wrapped around Raritan Bay, Sandy Hook, and the East River. Warships patrolled the Narrows and the Hudson River, and any merchant vessel seen aiding the Patriots was seized. Smugglers were hanged. Ports were closed. British Marines raided coastal towns and burned shipyards. It was an empire flexing its muscles. But in the creeks and coves of New Jersey, rebellion adapted. Privateers armed small vessels and launched lightning raids. A single sloop, crewed by 6 men, could strike a British supply line and vanish before pursuit. The blockade, though brutal, could not seal every inlet. At Sandy Hook, the lighthouse became a symbol of imperial control. The British captured it early and used it to guide their fleet safely into port, yet that very light also became a target. Patriots attempted several times to sabotage it, to darken the harbor entrance and confuse enemy ships. These attacks, often in the dead of night, never fully succeeded, but they did show the lengths that the rebellion would go. Perhaps the greatest strength the Americans had was intelligence. Through the Culper spy ring, signals and letters flowed from New York into New Jersey, often via rowboat under the cover of night. British plans, troop movements, and supply logs were intercepted and passed to Washington. This Culper spy ring I'm talking about will frequently be part of our story as we continue. On the British side, Admiral Howe grew increasingly frustrated. The waters they thought they ruled were suddenly treacherous. Supply ships disappeared. Raids increased. Morale slipped. One officer wrote, quote, "There is more danger in a single longboat than in a battalion of their infantry. They are vermin on the tides, elusive and tireless." The war on the water became one of attrition. British ships had strength, no doubt, but little mobility in tight rivers. Patriots had speed, but little firepower. It was chess on the water, and every shoal was a potential trap. The psychological effect of the blockade was enormous, however. Once bustling local commerce hubs, towns like Perth Amboy and South Amboy stared out at red-coated sentries and anchored warships. Their wharves grew quiet. Their taverns sullen. Ships seemed to be rotting in slips, and fishermen who once cast nets now whispered intelligence across barrels of salt cod. Loyalists, emboldened by the British presence, began to spy on their neighbors. Families were torn apart, not only by cannonballs, but by ideology. A brother would join the King's army, a cousin joined Washington's army. In towns like Woodbridge and Middletown and Shrewsbury, you might pass a friend in the street on Tuesday and report him to a loyalist on Wednesday. Admiral Richard Howe knew how to project fear. Every boom of a distant cannon, every captured sloop paraded like a trophy was a message to the colonies. We own these waters, we command these coasts.
The overconfident British Empire really believed it could stop us in our tracks. Fortunately, they were quite wrong. And so, this story is far from over. Unfortunately, the revolution would continue to shake the faith of many loyal patriots. And even General George Washington would begin to feel less confident in his own abilities to lead his army against the greatest army in the world. This incredible story of America's defense of its Declaration of Independence would take many turns and suffer a bit more tragedy before any finality would arrive, providing a young America with a fresh start as a new nation. Fighting for freedom on Raritan Bay was a very different kind of war. A war of secrecy and clandestine movements on dark nights, with bold raids against the British with nothing more than the determination of a few patriots in a rowboat. This is a story you may not believe, so stay tuned for the continuation of this dramatic and rarely heard story of what really happened on the waterways and how America actually came to win. Its independence as researched and written by historian and author John Schneider for his 7-part series celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. There's definitely much more to come, and you won't want to miss any of it. It's a time in our nation's history you'll want to see for yourself.